today to have in our virtual studio Dr. Matt Zakreski. And from this point forward, I'll refer to him as Dr. Matt or Matt. But let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Matt and why I'm thrilled to have him in the studio. He's a seasoned clinical psychologist and speaker, renowned for his expertise in serving neurodivergent individuals. It means people with different brains, such as gifted, ADHD, autism, dyslexia. And Dr. Matt thrives in supporting young people in understanding, developing, and celebrating their unique brains while developing strength-based ways of operating in the world. He's best known for his work with gifted individuals as an advocate for using accessible understanding of neurodivergent needs to implement high-level supports. Having delivered over 500 talks all over the world, Dr. Matt has cultivated a reputation as a dynamic keynote speaker, captivating audiences with his insightful presentations and empowering messages. Dr. Matt, again, I'm really just delighted that you're in the virtual studio. Why don't you say a few words about yourself?
I mean, well, you hit all the highlights. It's such a treat for me to be in this space because a lot of the podcasts I get to go on are education-based, are psychology-based, are parenting-based, because that's mostly what I do. But the more we learn about neurodivergent people, we realize that, you don't just age out of ADHD when you're 18, right? You don't stop being gifted when you stop going to school. It's a brain you have your whole life, which means that HR professionals are the new battleground. They're the new front lines when it comes to serving the people that I work with. So anytime I get to help a lot of professionals, help a lot of adults in the workplace, I mean, to me, it feels like a huge investment in making people's lives better, which is why I do what I do.
Well, one of the things you say, Dr. Matt, is you bring your brain with you wherever you go, whether you're a student in school or a professional adult or someone trying to figure out your way in the world. But as is the case for many or most, we don't have enough information to understand and process what our brains do for us and how that manifests in the world. And I think that's where you come in. Can you help us understand that a little bit better?
I mean, absolutely. So one of the things that we do when it comes to talking about neurodivergence, right, is that it's a condition that's sort of defined by it being atypical, right? So if you think about 4 out of 5 people are neurotypical, right? Their brains work basically as we'd expect them to work for their age and life and skill set, right? So your average 10-year-old is basically 10 socially, emotionally, physically, intellectually. They're basically 10 in everything they do. The more neurodivergent you are, the more that development becomes asynchronous or out of sync. And it's because different brains develop differently. So you might be a 23-year-old recent college grad, and you might have the intellectual capacity of a 30-year-old, but the social and emotional skills of a high school kid, right? And that's creating a lot of tension on your internal system because you're like, I could go toe-to-toe with the CEO and talk about market development, and I could pitch a product, and I would be great at it. But somebody spilled my coffee in the break room, and I screamed and punched a refrigerator. And that's why I'm talking to my HR guy, right? So it's this idea of if you've ever felt like you don't fit with other people or you don't feel like you fit together, those are signs that you may be neurodivergent in some way.
So I would imagine if we were to construct the definition of neurodivergence in a very broad sense, we'd have a lot of neurodivergent people in the workforce. Is that right or wrong, or what do you know about that?
What we find is that neurodivergent people tend to cluster in certain fields, right? So, you might get a lot of people who are, who are in sales and marketing, who are extroverts, right? And they sort of run on that wavelength. But then you have people who are a little bit extra, and that's that where you start thinking about, like, is that ADHD, right? It's a bit of a cliche, but many cliches come from a true place, that a lot of people who are in the IT cybersecurity fields are on the autism spectrum, right? Because it's concrete and it's numbers, it's ones and zeros, it's rules. Those things make sense.
Right.
Not like, one of the things I like to say is not every doctor is gifted, but a lot of surgeons are, because it's that next level. It's not just smart, it's that next ineffable thing. And, I know a couple of surgeons who are just absolute walking encyclopedias, right? They have the social skills of a wet paper bag, right? Because that development, it's like they memorized Grey's Anatomy, but they have no interest in understanding that the people in the movie are different people. They're just faces on a screen, right? So you get into this sense of, like, if 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent, they exist in all walks of life. They're teachers and police officers and drive ice cream trucks and brew beer and are park rangers and everything in between. But what we tend to see is that some fields, like the restaurant industry, the arts, medicine, tend to cluster more neurodivergent types in, based on the kinds of brains that one needs to be successful in those spaces.
And what's your connection with all of this? I mean, how did you go into this part of the world to exercise your gifts?
So I was identified as gifted in 2nd grade, and it meant I got to do a lot of really cool things. And I was diagnosed with ADHD in high school. So I'm what's known as twice exceptional, gifted plus a second neurodivergence. And we know that one neurodivergence predicts others, right? So if you're dyslexic, you are much more likely to be autistic or ADHD or OCD, just based on how the brain works. And being diagnosed with ADHD in high school really helped me explain a lot of things about myself. And I said to my parents, who are both clinical psychologists, I said, if I ever do what you guys do, I want to work with kids like me. And fast forward many years, getting through college and getting jobs in the real world, like, you develop a lot of coping strategies that work based on sort of trial and error. You're sort of figuring it out as you go. And I thought, gee, like, I should work with kids and adults who don't have the wherewithal to look and develop these skills, or think the only way to do this is to do XYZ, when there's a whole other alphabet of strategies out, right? So sometimes sitting down and talking to a person who's neurodivergent and saying, like, hey, you have been very successful doing this. Imagine if you could be that successful without working as hard. And they sort of stare at you like, it's almost like QVC, right? It's like, but wait, it could be easier. It's like, I don't trust you. This seems too good to be true. But if you understand how your brain works, that awareness moves away from, it must be me that's broken, to my brain works differently. And that is a fundamental shift for a lot of people.
And what would you say about neurodivergence in leaders and in leadership?
Neurodivergent people can make amazing leaders. Because they think outside the box. They aren't constrained by rules. One of my favorite things about neurodivergent people is that, give a neurodivergent person a rule that they understand and it makes sense, they'll follow the rule forever. If you give a neurodivergent person a rule that doesn't make any sense to them, they'll never listen to you, right? And, and you think about the iconoclasts, the people who've really remade the world, they said to Steve Jobs, like, you can't have a music player that is that small. And he goes, watch me, right? You think about the guys who did Uber, and they were like, no one will ever decentralize taxis before. Taxis are an unassailable industry. Watch me, right? There are people who, if they don't get the rule, they are perfectly predisposed to challenge it, break it, and reset the world. So a lot of leadership is going to be people who think outside the box and come at things a different way. And while that can be incredibly awesome, you also want to make sure that you've got infrastructure support around those leaders, because one of the things that neurodivergent people tend to struggle with is what we call theory of mind, or the idea that you exist outside of me. You don't think like I do. You don't have the same thoughts and opinions I do. And my thoughts and opinions, I'm going to give extra credit to because they're mine. So have you ever had a boss, Mike, that's like, well, how come you just didn't do it that way? And you're like, I never thought to do it that way. I'm not you. Right. But neurodivergent leaders tend to struggle with that lack of perspective taking. So they might say like, well, I just drank 6 Red Bulls and coded all night. How come you didn't do that? And, and your employee might be like, I have a family. I don't like Red Bull. I hold work-life boundaries, right? Whatever those things might be. And to be the most successful, whether that's in work or school or in the community, it's about meeting people where they are and understanding what's the best way to move them forward.
And what are some of the best ways to do that? What are some suggestions or solutions that you put into your practice, Dr. Matt?
So I try to be really concrete. I think that, one of the things that I truly believe is that theory only takes you so far, but what really matters is practice. Like if you have strategies that are tangible and accessible and anybody can do, then you're giving yourself and your kid a fighting chance to have a better life. So, one of my mentors always used to say to me is, if your strategy for change is, if only everybody would just ... then you're going to need a new strategy because that's never going to work. Everybody's never going to just ... whatever the thing might be. People don't work that way. But if you lean into the other side of it, right, then you can see it more like, what's the right way to say this? So, you might need, if you're somebody who's in an office, you're like, if everybody would just leave me alone, I could get more work done. Well, they're not going to leave you alone. It's an open office plan. But But if we give you a room with a door, you can shut the door and get your work done. Right? That's the tangible, practical stuff we're trying to do. And if that comes from a place of understanding that, hey, you have a different brain, then leadership is going to understand that a lot more.
Right. So I guess one of the questions I have is just how do we all be happier around this situation? Is that possible?
I mean, that's my job, right?
Right.
So there are sort of three things that I try to center in the work I do around having people have happier lives. So the first thing is, can you change the situation you have enough to meet your needs? So if you're somebody who, let's say, is autistic, and you don't like coming to the office, the fluorescent lights bug you, there are too many people around, you don't like water cooler small talk, you just want to get your damn work done, well, then we can absolutely use autism as an accommodation to have you work from home. Right. And one of the people I serve, we just set it up that he only has to come in 5 days a year, right? I mean, like the spring kickoff, the winter kickoff, the summer shareholder meeting, and a couple other ones that I can't think of right now.
Right.
Well, then he gets to work from home. Now, if he chooses to come into the office, he grabs the terminal and he gets his work done. Right. But the default is playing to his needs. Right. So that's a shift we could make. And if you can't do that, then you move into step 2, which is, can you find a job that plays to your strengths? Right. One of the adults I used to work with was a university professor. And he's like, I love teaching. I love writing. I love presenting at conferences. I don't like committee meetings. I don't like interviewing undergrads. I don't like, being on the university, steering committee for ethical guidelines and community research. Right. So we ended up setting it up that now he's an adjunct, and he adjuncts a couple classes a year, right? And he's using that extra time to write more books. And we've sort of cobbled together a job that focused more on the things he actually wanted that job for, rather than the minutia that was like totally weighing him down.
Right.
And that's sort of a nice segue into option 3, which is a lesson I learned from one of my favorite books of all time, which is it's called How to Be Everything by Emily Wapnick. Amazing book. And the whole idea here is that you may not be somebody who can quit your high-paying finance job, right? You might have a mortgage, you might have a family, you might have a car loan or kids in college or whatever it is, right? So if you can't quit your job and you don't have time for like a side hustle, then how can you bring in the things that make you passionate into your life in some other way?
Right.
And that might be you do community theater on weekends. That might be that you start writing fan fiction. That might be that you start a podcast, right? The idea here is that our brains tend to think about things in all or nothing components. I'm either going to be a professional dancer or I have to sell out and have another job. No, it's hard to make a living as a professional dancer. But if you work your 9 to 5 and then on Saturday mornings you do a 3-hour Zumba class with your friends, that's a damn sight better than nothing, right? So what we want to model here is what we call bottom-up thinking, right? If the default is I do nothing to make my life better, every step I take to make my life better is value added, right? If you take a 30-minute online Zumba class once a week, it's better than taking no dance at all, right? And you may fall in love with it and get more opportunities and get to do more and more of that thing. But it starts with giving yourself permission to do something.
Wonderful, Dr. Matt. And Dr. Matt, if people wanted to get in touch with you or wanted to extend this conversation, where would they look? Where would the best places to go be? And we'll put these in the show notes as well.
Awesome. So I have 2 sort of primary online presences.
Yeah.
So the first is my therapy practice, which is the Neurodiversity Collective. It's me and a couple of my colleagues, and we serve neurodivergent kids, adults, and families all over the country, helping them live happier, more meaningful lives. So that's what we're here to do. The second thing is, if you're, say, an HR professional and you're listening to this, you're like, oh my gosh, like this pharmaceutical company I work for absolutely has a lot of neurodivergent people in it, and we have no idea how to serve them. That's when you'd contact me to come in and say, do a speech for you, like do a workshop. I do a lot of training and talks at conferences. So that's www.drmattzakreski.com. Now, if you end up at one, you should be at the other. It's not like we're not going to work with you, right? It's just those are the 2 main things I do, right? So it's drmattzakreski.com for speaking, consulting, training. Love to do keynote workshops, love to work with organizations to help them do better. And then there's, and then if you're like, okay, so my organization needs help, but I also need help, then it's the neurodiversitycollective.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Matt, for sharing those resources, and be sure to find them in the show notes. It's been really enlightening for me to have you as a guest on the People Dividend, and so much more to learn on this topic. It's so important in terms of developing organizations that are built on cultures of respect and dignity and recognizing individuals in all an aesthetic process. So thank you, Dr. Matt.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So until the next episode of The People Dividend, stay well.